The dojo smelled of sweat, liniment, and worn leather, a scent that had soaked into the wooden floors over decades. It was 1965, late afternoon in Oakland, California, and the sun cut through the high windows in dusty golden shafts, illuminating particles that danced like tiny fireflies suspended in amber light. The space was modest, perhaps 40 feet by 30, with mirrors along one wall and heavy bags hanging like silent sentries. From reinforced ceiling beams, the floorboards creaked with history, each scuff mark and indentation a testament to 10,000 kicks, 100,000 footfalls. Bruce Lee stood alone in the center of the room, 24 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds of coiled precision. He wore simple black cotton pants and nothing else, his torso bare and gleaming faintly with the sheen of recent exertion. His muscles weren't the bulging masses you'd see on bodybuilders. They were lean, defined, each fiber visible beneath taut skin like cables wrapped tight around bone. He moved through forms with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics, his body transitioning from stillness to explosive motion and back again so smoothly that the eye struggled to track the intervals between. What most people didn't know, what the newspapers and martial arts magazines hadn't yet discovered, was that Bruce had been fighting migraines for 3 days straight. The pain sat behind his left eye like a heated poker, pulsing with each heartbeat, making even the afternoon light feel aggressive. He'd barely slept. His wife Linda had begged him to cancel today's session, but he'd simply kissed her forehead and left their small apartment before dawn. Pain was just sensation. Sensation was just information. Information could be acknowledged without attachment. He stopped mid-movement, perfectly still, his breathing so controlled it was almost imperceptible. His eyes were closed. To an observer, he might have been meditating, but his awareness was completely external. Catalog, the distant sound of traffic on Broadway, the barely audible hum of the refrigerator in the small office, the shift in air pressure as the door at the far end of the dojo opened. Footsteps, heavy, confident. 3 distinct sets of feet, but one moved with particular weight, not just physical mass, but the kind of weight that comes from a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he enters. Bruce opened his eyes but didn't turn around. In the mirror, he watched 3 men enter. The 2 flanking figures were younger, maybe early 20s, athletic builds, moving with the careful posture of trained fighters trying to look casual, but it was the man in the center who drew the eye. Victor Chen, 6'2", 220 pounds, 43 years old. His face was weathered and hard, with a scar running from his left temple to his jawline, an old wound that had healed badly. Puckering the skin, he wore traditional kung fu attire, silk and immaculate, deep crimson with gold embroidery along the sleeves. Everything about him announced status, accomplishment, lineage. He was a master of Northern Shaolin, with 3 schools across San Francisco, and a reputation that stretched back to Beijing before the revolution. He was also, Bruce had learned, 2 weeks ago, the man who'd been telling every Chinese martial arts instructor in California that Bruce Lee was a traitor to tradition, a show-off, a sellout, teaching sacred techniques to white students for money. Victor's voice cut through the space like a blade drawn from its sheath. It was deep, resonant, carrying the weight of decades of command. So this is the famous Bruce Lee school. He spoke in Cantonese, each word precisely enunciated, smaller than I expected. Bruce turned slowly, his movements economical. His face was neutral, almost pleasant. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, barely above conversational volume, but it carried perfectly across the space. Master Chen, this is unexpected. Is it? Victor walked forward, his students remaining near the door like guards. His eyes scanned the dojo with obvious disdain, lingering on the mirrors, the modern heady bags, the lack of traditional weapons displays. I heard you've been teaching our ancient arts to anyone with money. Whites, blacks, it doesn't matter to you, does it? 3,000 years of Chinese tradition? And you hand it out like fast food. The air in the room changed, became denser. The dust particles in those golden shafts of sunlight seemed to slow their dancing. Bruce said nothing for a long moment. His hands hung loosely at his sides. His breathing remained perfectly even despite the migraine that now felt like it was trying to split his skull in half. He studied Victor's face, seeing beneath the anger to something deeper. Fear. Fear of a changing world. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that everything he'd built his identity upon was already crumbling. You came to my school to tell me this? Bruce's tone carried no challenge, no heat, simple curiosity. I came to see if you're as good as the stories claim. Victor stopped 10 feet away, settling into a horse stance that was textbook perfect, knees bent, weight centered, hands raised in a classical guard position. I don't believe you are. I think you're fast and flashy, good enough to impress people who don't know better. But against a true master, against someone who learned from the source, who carries the lineage. He smiled, and it wasn't kind. I think you'll fold like paper. One of the students near the door shifted his weight, nervous energy radiating from him. The other remained still, but his eyes were wide, darting between the two men. Bruce felt the migraine pulse behind his eye, felt the exhaustion in his limbs from 3 nights of poor sleep, felt the floor beneath his bare feet, cool and smooth, felt the weight of this moment. Understanding with perfect clarity that what happened in the next few minutes would define him in ways that extended far beyond this room. This afternoon, these men. He could refuse, could ask them to leave, could explain that he had no interest in proving anything. But Victor hadn't come for explanation. He'd come because Bruce represented something that terrified him, the idea that the old ways weren't the only ways, that tradition wasn't the same as truth, that a young man with new ideas could be just as valid, just as skilled, just as worthy of respect as someone who'd spent 40 years memorizing forms. This wasn't about fighting. It was about permission. Permission to exist, permission to teach, permission to evolve. Bruce stepped forward, closing the distance to 8 feet and then 6. His movement was so smooth, it looked like floating, like his feet never quite left the ground. He stopped just outside striking range, his posture completely relaxed. Hands at his sides, weight distributed evenly. Victor's eyes narrowed, his stance deepened, the muscles in his forearms tensed, visible even beneath the silk sleeves. You want to see if I'm as good as the stories? Bruce said softly. His voice held no aggression, no mockery. But you've already decided I'm not. You've decided I'm a traitor, a sellout, unworthy of the tradition. So what you really want is to prove yourself right, to make an example of me, to show your students and yourself that the old ways still matter most. Victor's jaw tightened. Talk is cheap. Yes, Bruce agreed. It is. The silence that followed stretched like wire pulled taut. Outside, a car horn blared. Inside, the refrigerator hummed. One of the students near the door exhaled audibly, then caught himself, embarrassed by the sound. Bruce lifted his right hand slowly, palm open, fingers relaxed. He held it between them, not in guard position, not in any classical stance, just raised, as if he were about to wave hello or touch Victor's shoulder in friendship. I'll make you an offer, Bruce said. You can attack me however you want, whatever technique you prefer. Your best strike, your fastest combination, whatever you feel will work. I won't block. I won't strike back. I'll just move slightly. He paused, letting the words settle, and you'll understand. Victor's face darkened. Red crept up his neck, flooded his cheeks. You're mocking me. No, Bruce's voice remained perfectly calm, perfectly even. I'm teaching you, but you have to be willing to learn. The student near the door, the nervous one, made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Victor heard it, and something in his expression shifted. Pride had been insulted. Now it was wounded, and a wounded pride is a dangerous thing. Fine. Victor's voice dropped lower, became harder. Don't block. Don't strike back. Just move. We'll see how well that works. He exploded forward without warning, covering the 6 feet between them in a fraction of a second. His right hand shot out in a vertical punch aimed directly at Bruce's solar plexus. A technique called the Sun Fist, designed to drive through the center line and collapse the diaphragm. It was fast, genuinely fast. 40 years of training channeled into a single strike that cut through the air with a sound like tearing fabric. Bruce moved, not back, not to the side in any dramatic, sweeping evasion. He simply shifted his weight, rotated his torso maybe 3 inches to the left, angled his shoulder down slightly, and Victor's fist passed through empty air where Bruce's center had been a microsecond earlier. Victor stumbled, just slightly. His momentum carried him forward a half step beyond where he'd intended to stop, forcing him to adjust his stance, redistribute his weight. Before he could reset, Bruce had already moved again, a subtle pivot that placed him just outside Victor's peripheral vision, close enough that Victor could feel his presence but couldn't pinpoint exactly where without turning his head. Victor spun, throwing a back fist as he turned, but Bruce wasn't there anymore. He'd float around to the other side, his movement so economical it looked like he'd simply materialized in a new position, rather than traveled through the space between. Victor tried a low kick, then a high punch, then a combination, jab, cross, hook, each technique perfectly executed with power and speed that would have devastated most opponents. Bruce evaded them all with movements so minimal they barely qualified as evasion. A weight shift, an angle change, a tiny step that left him exactly where he needed to be for Victor. It striked to pass harmlessly by, and with each miss, Victor had to work harder, had to extend further, had to commit more weight, more energy, more intention to techniques that connected with nothing but air. 30 seconds passed, then 45. Victor was breathing hard now, his silk shirt darkening with sweat under the arms, across the chest. His movements were becoming slightly less precise, slightly more desperate. He threw a spinning back kick, a powerful technique, but one that required commitment, that left you briefly vulnerable if it missed. It missed. Bruce had simply leaned back 6 inches, letting the kick pass in front of his face close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. And when Victor completed the spin and landed, Bruce was already back in position, his hands still at his sides, his breathing still perfectly controlled. Victor tried again and again. Punch combinations, kick combinations, grappling attempts. He threw everything in his considerable arsenal, each technique executed with the precision of a master who'd spent decades perfecting his art. And none of it touched Bruce Lee. 1 minute became two, two became three. Victor's breathing was ragged now, his face flushed dark red, sweat running down his temples, dripping from his chin. His movements were slowing, becoming heavier, less coordinated. His students watched in frozen silence, their faces pale, unable to process what they were seeing. Bruce hadn't thrown a single strike, hadn't blocked a single attack, hadn't done anything that could reasonably be called fighting. He'd just moved slightly. At the 3.5 minute mark, Victor threw a desperate overhand right, putting everything he had left into it, and missed so badly that his own momentum spun him in a complete circle. He stumbled, caught himself, and stood there gasping, hands on his knees, sweat dripping onto the wooden floor in dark spots that spread like ink on paper. Bruce stood 5 feet away, exactly as he'd been when this began, calm, centered, his chest rising and falling with the same controlled rhythm as before. The migraine still pulsed behind his eye, but it was distant now, relegated to background information. He waited until Victor looked up, met his eyes. "You're exhausted," Bruce said quietly. "Not because I fought you, because you fought yourself. Every technique you threw required you to commit, to extend your energy, your intention, your balance, into space where I wasn't. You were fighting a ghost, fighting your assumption of where I would be, instead of responding to where I actually was." Victor's breath came in shuddering gasps. His hands trembled. The student near the door looked like he might be sick. Bruce took a step closer, not threatening, almost gentle. "This is what I teach my students. Not techniques, not forms, not tradition for tradition's sake." His voice was soft, but it carried an intensity that made the words feel heavy, important. "I teach them to be like water. You can't punch water, you can't kick it. It doesn't resist you, it flows around you, accepts your force, and continues being water." That's not disrespecting tradition. That's understanding what the tradition was always trying to teach. Victor straightened slowly, painfully. His legs shook. His pride, that wounded, dangerous thing, was visible in his eyes, warring with something else, something newer, something that looked like recognition. You didn't even... He couldn't finish the sentence, didn't have the breath for it. "I didn't need to," Bruce said. "That's the point. Power isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how little force you need to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. You came here to prove I was unworthy of teaching, to show that I was a fraud, a betrayer of our tradition." He paused, letting the words settle. But what if the real betrayal is refusing to evolve, refusing to question, insisting that the way you learned is the only way that matters? The silence that followed was different than before. The tension was gone, replaced by something rawer, more honest. One of the students near the door, the nervous one, spoke suddenly, his voice cracking. "Sifu, we should go." But Victor didn't move. He stood there, sweat-soaked and trembling, staring at Bruce Lee with an expression that was equal parts devastation and wonder. "How?" His voice was barely a whisper. "How do you move like that?" Bruce smiled, not mockingly, not with arrogance, with genuine warmth. "The same way you learn to move. The way you move. Practice. Repetition. But more importantly, I had to unlearn first. I had to let go of everything I thought I knew about fighting, about power, about what made someone skilled. I had to empty my cup before I could fill it with something new." He walked to the small office area, returned with a towel, and held it out to Victor. The older man stared at it for a long moment, then took it, pressed it to his face. "I have 40 years, Victor said, his voice muffled by the towel. 40 years of training, of teaching, of being respected, and you made it look meaningless." "No," Bruce's voice was firm now, carrying weight. "I showed you that it's not enough. There's a difference. Everything you know, everything you've learned, it's valuable. It's real. But if you stop there, if you treat it like the destination instead of a milestone along a longer journey, then you stop growing. You become rigid, and rigid things break. Victor lowered the towel. His eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from exhaustion or emotion was impossible to say. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. What remained sounded almost childlike in its honesty. Could you teach me what you just did? Bruce regarded him quietly. Outside, the sun had shifted, and those golden shafts of light had moved across the floor, stretching toward the door. The dust particles still danced, indifferent to the transformation unfolding beneath them. I could teach you the principles, Bruce said carefully. But you'd have to be willing to set aside your ego to accept that being a master of one thing doesn't make you a master of everything. To understand that there are 17-year-old students in this school who might teach you something valuable if you're humble enough to listen. Victor's jaw worked. Decades of identity, of status, of carefully constructed self-image hung in the balance. His students watched from the door, their faces pale mirrors of his internal struggle. Finally, slowly, Victor bowed. Not the shallow, perfunctory bow of greeting, a deep bow from the waist, holding it for 3 full seconds, the bow a student gives to a teacher. When he straightened, his eyes were bright. I have spent 40 years teaching people that tradition is everything, he said quietly. That the old ways are sacred, that to change them is to disrespect them. But watching you today, he trailed off, shook his head. You didn't disrespect anything. You honored it by making it better, by making it true. Bruce placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. The touch was light, friendly. The old ways are sacred, he said. But sacred doesn't mean frozen. It means worthy of care, worthy of attention, worthy of being carried forward, not just preserved in amber. The masters who created those techniques were innovators in their time. They experimented. They questioned. They evolved their arts based on real experience. The most traditional thing we can do is follow their example, not their conclusions. They stood like that for a moment. Two martial artists, separated by almost 20 years in an ocean of philosophy, connected by the honest transaction that had just occurred. Victor's students approached hesitantly. The nervous one spoke, his voice steadier now. Sifu, we should return to the school. Victor nodded, but before leaving, he turned back to Bruce. I told every instructor in San Francisco that you were a fraud, that you were dangerous to our tradition. I was wrong. I'll tell them that too. You don't have to, Bruce said. Yes, Victor's voice was firm. I do, because that's what teachers are supposed to do. Tell the truth, even when it costs us something, especially then. He bowed again, then walked to the door, his students flanking him before stepping out into the afternoon. He paused, looked back one more time. Thank you, he said, for not destroying me when you could have, for teaching me instead. Bruce smiled. Breaking someone is easy. Any fool with enough power can do that. Helping them rebuild themselves into something better, that takes real skill. That's the difference between being a fighter and being a master. The door closed. The dojo was silent again, except for the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the small sounds of an old building settling into evening. Bruce walked to the heady bag, rested his forehead against it, and closed his eyes. The migraine was still there, pulsing like a second heartbeat. His body ached from the tension of absolute awareness, absolute control, absolute precision maintained across nearly 4 minutes that had felt like hours. But there was something else, too, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning. He'd given Victor Chen something more valuable than defeat. He'd given him a path forward, a choice, the opportunity to evolve instead of ossify. That night, Bruce would go home to Linda, would hold his infant son Brandon, would fall asleep in his small apartment with its thin walls and secondhand furniture. In the years to come, he'd face bigger challenges, bigger stages, bigger opportunities. But in some ways, this afternoon would remain one of his most important victories, not over an opponent, but over the idea that power must be demonstrated through destruction. 10 years later, in 1975, Bruce Lee would be gone, dead at 32 from a cerebral edema that no amount of skill or speed or wisdom could prevent. But the lesson from that October afternoon in 1965 would persist. Victor Chen would continue teaching Northern Shaolin, but his approach would change. He'd begin incorporating principles of flow, of minimal movement, of responding rather than imposing. His students would notice the difference. The way he listened more, dictated less, questioned his own assumptions openly. He'd tell the story of the afternoon he attacked Bruce Lee hundreds of times over the decades, always ending it the same way. I came to prove he was wrong. Instead, he proved I was capable of being better than I was. That's the definition of a real teacher. One of Victor's students, a young woman named Helen who'd been told by multiple schools that Kung Fu wasn't for girls, would eventually open her own school in Sacramento. She'd teach both traditional forms and Bruce's concepts of adaptation and flow, refusing to see them as contradictory. On her wall, she'd hang two photos, one of her bowing to Victor Chen at her black belt ceremony and one of Bruce Lee mid-movement. Captured in that state of perfect awareness that looks like stillness in motion, she'd tell her own students, "This is where I came from and this is where I'm going." Both matter. The past and the future aren't enemies, they're partners. By 2010, there would be Bruce Lee statues in 3 countries, movies depicting his life, books analyzing his philosophy, but the statue and movies and books would struggle to capture what Victor Chen felt in that dojo in Oakland. The breathtaking power of restraint, the revolutionary act of not destroying someone when you had every right and ability to do so. Because here's the truth that most people miss. Bruce Lee wasn't famous because he could fight. Thousands of people can fight. He was famous, is still famous, because he understood that wheel mastery isn't about domination. It's about precision, about using exactly as much force as necessary and no more, about teaching instead of destroying, about building people up instead of tearing them down. That afternoon, Bruce could have humiliated Victor Chen, could have struck him, injured him, demolished his reputation and his confidence in front of his own students. It would have been easy, justified even after the insults, the disrespect, the aggressive challenge. But he didn't. He moved slightly and let Victor exhaust himself against the ghost of his own assumptions. Then he offered a towel, a conversation, and a path forward. That's the story, not the fighting. The choice that came after the fighting, the choice to teach instead of triumph, to build instead of break, to transform an enemy into a student. So let me ask you something. Think about the last time you won an argument. The last time you were right and someone else was wrong. The last time you had power in a situation and the other person had none. What did you do at that moment? Did you press your advantage? Prove your point? Make sure they knew, really knew, that you were right and they were wrong? Or did you offer a towel and a conversation? Did you see their humiliation and feel satisfied? Or did you see their potential and feel responsible? Because that's the real test, not how you handle being challenged, but how you handle winning. Bruce Lee never blocked an attack. He simply moved slightly and his attacker fell exhausted. But what he did next, what he chose to do with that victory, that's the lesson that lasted 50 years. That's the moment that changed lives. That's the difference between being powerful and being wise. So what will you choose the next time you're standing in that dojo, watching someone who challenged you collapse under the weight of their own assumptions? Will you walk away satisfied that you proved your point? Or will you hand them a towel and show them a better way? The answer to that question will define you more than any technique you master, any opponent you defeat, any victory you claim. Because in the end, the only real question that matters is this: what will people remember about you after you're gone? The fights you won, or the people you helped become better than they were? Bruce Lee knew the answer. And do you?